So here we are, page 31 of In Quest of Truth. But even now, as I write more than 25 years later, I cannot see that the scientific attitude towards life has much changed. The majority of scientists are still hypnotized by what they consider to be, quote, the methods of science, end quote. They still harp on, quote unquote, evolutionary humanism. They write about, quote, adequate naturalistic belief systems, end quote, and keep on hoping that an eventual scientific restatement of religion will come that will explain everything. But it really does seem that Darwin's doctrine of evolution by natural selection has had its day so far, as the idea goes, of a blind and purposeless evolution that has contributed so largely to modern atheistical thought. Man is more than a mere bundle of quote unquote conditioned reflexes, as some biologists would have us believe. But I see that the usual grandiose prophetic statements were made at the celebration of the Darwin centenary at the University of Chicago, January 1960. Sir Julian Huxley even went so far as to declare that man would no longer quote, take refuge from his loneliness in the arms of a divinized father figure whom he has himself created, end quote. Now science is faced with more startling facts than ever before. I refer to the UFO, unidentified flying objects. As I write now, I find that there are over 100 books written in various languages on these mysterious objects, to say nothing of all the UFO societies that have sprung up. And so why is this momentous subject ignored in official quarters? Again, we have the facts that do not fit. In 1959, near Cape Town, I was sitting in the garden and happened to look up at the sky and suddenly saw about 14 or more saucers speeding across the sky in V-shaped formation. They made no noise and passed over at a great height in a few seconds. From what I understand from books written about them, the speed of these strange craft has been clocked up to 20,000 miles per hour. Nothing will ever persuade me that the flying objects I saw come from our planet. UFO phenomena seem to belong to the fourth dimension, a state at present still unrecognized by orthodox opinion. The lack of official interest is always a striking example of the inertia of the human mind and its resistance to innovation, for innovation is a threat to academic authority. To return to the subject of mediumistic work, one of the obstacles to investigation may be fraud. No doubt there will always be tricksters, but it should always be remembered that fraud is in itself often a form of dissociation that accompanies genuine phenomena. So there is no reason to get fraud on the brain. Also, Surely the importance of having honest and courageous investigators cannot be overestimated. Hence, the difficulties when people neither understand nor want to understand anything of the psychological quote unquote makeup of the medium's personality. Again, it should be noted that in cases of hypnotic trance, the operator works on the subject from his own world, whereas in mediumistic trance, the medium is controlled by a disembodied intelligence belonging to the unseen world whom sitters cannot see. The trouble sometimes with those of scientific persuasion is that they may have so little comprehension of the phenomena they are witnessing that they sometimes do not cooperate to provide the sympathetic atmosphere so vitally important for the production of satisfactory results. Then again, on no account should anyone ever risk molesting a medium in trance. A certain London physician showed me with great pride a bottle in his laboratory that contained ectoplasm. He explained that he had, quote, cut it off, end quote, at a seance. The result was that he had his unfortunate victim dangerously ill with an internal hemorrhage for several weeks in a hospital. It is not possible to go into more details concerning life in the hereafter. Many books have been already written by competent writers who have spent a lifetime on this subject. But one fact stands out clear to those who think, VIZ, that we are enabled to realize how much the priesthoods, which should be the custodians of our spiritual welfare, have so far failed to exercise their duties. We are prepared for heaven and hell without realizing that such states of mind are but illusory thought forms of the false ego, which has not yet been replaced by the real self, and which has not yet been replaced by the real self and transcended the domain of ignorance, which is Maya. Chapter 2. Gloria, could you continue, please?
The Flower Girl. I cannot finish with psychic experiences without some reference to my adventures with Hilda Lewis, the famous flower medium. Parent, it is suggested that the reader who is unacquainted with apport mediumship should look up apport phenomena. An encyclopedia already mentioned it, parent. And the history of Hilda's case shows one of the worst bungled investigations in the annals of psychic research. In fact, it is difficult to understand how there could have been so much bungling unless we take into considerations the ordinary failings of human nature. Also remember the mysterious powers behind the scenes. Hilda was first discovered in 1934 when about 22 years of age. A Londoner of humble origin, her amazing feats brought her to the notice of eminent persons. She began to give seances at what is now called the British College of Psychic Science. Even men of scientific standing were invited to see her. I remember Julian Hockley, when present at one of her seances, remarked that if her phenomena were genuine, he would be obliged to overhaul his previous notions of physics. He didn't pursue investigation and has not been obliged to overhaul any of his previous convictions. The first I knew about Hilda was from reading articles about her in the newspapers. Then a friend brought her to see me. Also, Lord Charles Hope had spoken about her several times. His contention was that she must be a fraud because she produced roses that had no thorns. He spent, so he told me, some £400 on having her trailed by detectives. Later, Professor Fraser Harris gave me more information. One afternoon, he came in a very distressed because the flower medium, as she was called, had been in quote unquote exposed. He told he told me a tale of how four little bunches of flowers had been found in her suitcase prior to a seance. This would naturally appear extremely suspicious to any person with no knowledge of understanding of the complexities of mediumship. But what but what did the flowers matter as long as she was not allowed to produce them at the seance? Then, quite unexpectedly, on August 10th, I received a very agitated telephone call to the effect that Hilda had again been quote unquote exposed, this time by some spiritualist at the seance the night before, where she had been forced to make a written confession that she was incapable of any genuine phenomena. The shock of this last quote unquote exposure had made her ill, and she was now in a state bordering on collapse and incapable of looking after herself. And could I help? The confession, which was published in most of the psychic papers, had obviously been extracted under duress. The girl needed looking after and taking care of till her health was restored. Taking it for granted that my informant was more or less satisfied with the actual bona fides of the medium, I offered hospitality. The little girl, for she was small and slight, was brought to the London flat, obviously suffering from severe shock. Her personality was distinctly dissociated. Also, her body was covered with blisters and brown marks which looked like burns from a hot instrument. They were, as I knew, psychic burns, which may appear on a medium's body when molested during trance conditions. It is really extraordinary that those spiritualists didn't know no better than to manhandle a medium in deep trance. I took Hilda down to my brother's hospital, but he was away, so I saw another doctor who was most puzzled. I thought it advisable not to explain that she was a trance medium, otherwise he would have been still more mystified. He thought she was obviously a case of having been assaulted and that I should consult solicitors. Meanwhile, I managed to silence the big newspaper with a little tactful persuasion. 2 nights later, while I was sitting near her bed, she was revived and was at the time in a fairly normal condition. I noticed from the movements of her hands that she seemed to be shaping something, but there was nothing in her hands. So I asked her what she was doing, and she replied that she thought something was coming. Quote, quote. Then, to my astonishment, I saw the sudden appearance of a large pear. I was now very much on the alert, wondering how on earth she had managed to smuggle fruit into the flat. For knowing of her propensity for scattering fruit and flowers about wherever she went, even large objects like pineapples and bunches of grapes, I had taken special precaution to do all my own shopping, and I knew exactly what fruit there was in the flat, and certainly there were no pears. Then I ate the pear to convince myself of its reality. A few minutes later, I observed that Hilda looked as she was dozing, as her eyes were shut and her hands were still, but in the same cup-shaped position as before when the pair had arrived. Was she asleep? But I felt that something further was going to happen because she had murmured softly before the name of Saint Teresa with a look of reverence on her face, Also, she had looked over her shoulder as if she thought the saint was standing behind her. Saint Teresa of Lisieux was famous because of the flowers she apported in the convent. Meanwhile, I did not take my eyes off Hilda's hands for a psychic wind in my face and cold shivers down my spine warned me to expect supernormal phenomena in the process of manifesting. In short, another pair arrived. I took it gently out of her hands, which still never moved, retaining the same cup like position as before. Again, another pair. Before I had recovered from my astonishment, Hilda began to speak, and then I realized that it was not Hilda, but her control, quote unquote, Robin, who was speaking, for she was now in deep trance and quite unconscious. The control was, so I understood, from those who were acquainted with her phenomena, a small child who apparently presided over her psychic activities. Quote unquote, Robin was in tears like an upset child, but quote, quote, he thanked me for all I have done for his Mary and seemed very pleased over the pears, which proved so, quote, quote, he said that, quote, quote, his Mary was not, quote, quote, broken by the people who had so shockingly manhandled her. Meanwhile, an acrimonious correspondence was being waged in the psychic press by those for and against Hilda. There is no doubt that Lord Charles Hope's detective work on the girls proved conclusively that she sometimes bought flowers before Azians, as if that mattered in the least, provided they were taken from her before the Azians actually began, since she was always searched well in advance. But then again, Lord Charles Hope, like other investigators who are psychic and so have little understanding of the technique of mediumship, understood nothing of the psychological aspects of Hilda's case. I discussed this point with Robin, who explained that he could not always build up the phenomena of her materialized flowers without first of all working on the aura of ordinary flowers. Hence Hilda's unfortunate habit of sometimes buying flowers before the seance. It is, so I understand, known to some well acquainted with the mechanics of mediumship that the spirits cannot produce materializations out of nothing in their astral laboratories, and that they will, quote, quote, build up from the aura of the object required. But we ordinary mortals understand nothing of whatever goes on in the unseen world, and so are not in a position to judge or to dogmatize on matters quite beyond our ken. I took up the cudgels in Hilda's defense and contented myself with the argument that I was not interested in the medium's moral character, but only with her phenomena, which were genuine so far as I knew. Mr. Stanley de Brad, in answer to my appeal for supporters, gallantly came to the rescue, and Mr. Dudley Parsons, with true legal skill, pulled to pieces the incriminating evidence regarding the medium's, quote, exposure and confessions, end quote.
Oh, thanks, Gloria. Miguel, could you continue?
Another point I discovered was that the medium's guides work very badly on time. That is to say, they often brought about materializations of fruit, flowers, and other objects, even coins, just at the moment when such phenomena were least wanted or appreciated, thereby giving rise to suspicious situations, sometimes in perfectly innocent circumstances. Then again, objects might sometimes arrive just prior to the seance, or worse still, even at the moment of the search before the seance, which may be taking place. the most incriminating situation of all, almost impossible to explain to doubting and inexperienced investigators, with absolutely no appreciation of the difficulties and complexities of physical phenomena, and who are often more concerned to quarrel than to investigate. During the time that Hilda was with me, about 2 weeks, she even produced flowers in the presence of her astonished doctor, and I, myself, witnessed the most unusual phenomena, mental as well as physical. It will take a whole book to give all I learned about psychic matters from this amazing little girl, whose slight figure could hardly have concealed anything. Later, Dr. Fraser Harris paid me another visit when I asked him how it was that he was unable to make up his mind about her after some 30 seances. He excused himself on the grounds that she will not conform to his conditions before a seance. One of them was that she shall get into a bath of water up to the neck before a committee of ladies. When I asked whatever for, it seemed, according to him, that she, quote, might have a second membranous skin under which the flowers were hidden. This was from a man of scientific standing. I even went so far as to challenge the Society for Psychical Research to allow Hilda and myself to stay locked up in their laboratory for an indefinite number of days till they obtain phenomena under the strict fraud-proof conditions. But my challenge was not accepted. In short, nobody with any reputation to lose dared to follow up a full and impartial inquiry. Hilda was also suspected of conjuring feats far exceeding the capacity of the greatest professional jugglers. Quote unquote,
Conjuring tricks.
conjuring tricks. Conjuring tricks are always a stock excuse for explaining away phenomena which could never be conjured. A man with an international standing in the medical world wrote and asked me if Hilda will give a demonstration at his hospital. Hilda agreed to do so, providing my conditions were accepted. BIC, that she should first of all be fully examined by 4 of the sisters of the hospital, and then walk about 50 yards or so before them to ensure that the flowers will not be hidden in her vagina. Another stock excuse. She was then to sit in the middle of a circle of doctors, clad only in her bathing dress and a little jacket. The jacket to be examined beforehand. Finally, I wanted a paper to be signed to the effect that the seance will proceed under fraud-proof conditions. I received a reply back calling the seance off because the sponsor felt that he will be unable to believe the evidence of his senses. About this time, a well-known publisher asked me to write a little book about her because, so he said, quote, it will sell like hotcakes, end quote. So great was the interest taken at that time. However, I never got around to it. My impression of Hilda during her stay in the flat and later on was that her mind resembled a vessel open to whatever influences were about at the time. In many ways, she seemed to have a sweet and generous disposition, but her personality undoubtedly fluctuated between her quote unquote controls and herself. I came to the conclusion that, inside quotes, Robin was a somewhat mischievous, if not evil, entity who certainly managed to make a lot of mischief, impeding Hilda's supporters against one another. He also did not appear to be at all competent to protect her or to direct her phenomena. Indeed, those on the other side seemed to boggle her case as much as those on our side. It was all a most strangely puzzling affair. One of the most extraordinary facts about her was that she had no normal natural functions, no bowel actions. When I questioned her about this, she was embarrassed and uncomfortable at being considered abnormal. She thought the reason for her inability to function normally was due to the excrement being in some way transmuted into her flowers. Other people who knew her also informed me about this aspect. I arranged for her to have a colonic douche from two well-known early sane doctors, but they got no proper results. This most unusual physical characteristic should have been properly investigated, for it suggests that she was an elemental and not a normal human being. I have discussed her case with occultists, and they say that since no normal human being could live without natural functions, that she must be an elemental. There is a quote, an asterisk about elemental. Dion Fortune, in her remarkable book, Psychic Self-Defense, republished in 1952 by the Aquarium Press, gives some interesting observations on the elementals. The mysterious lights sometimes seen in the region of her solar plexus also suggest elemental origin. Both Sir Alexander Cannon and Mr. Wright gave me remarkable evidence of her supernormal phenomena, and Mr. Wright even witnessed spirit materializations. He told me his mother materialized. To get back to her roses and other flowers, the most noticeable charge against her was that her roses were always thornless, but there were never any scars on the stems to show that they had been removed. I pointed this out to Julian Huxley and others. I was in fact the only person to take the trouble to ascertain from Kew Gardens that there was only one thornless rose in existence at that time, which was a climbing ramble and certainly never sold in the flower shops. But no one paid any attention to this fact. Dr. McDowell was really one of the few fair-minded inquirers, and he did ask me to bring her to Duke University if I could arrange matters satisfactorily, where I have no doubt that she would have been properly treated. Unfortunately, however, Poor Hilda had had about enough of investigations from impartially tribunals. Also, the increasing strain of so much controversy and hostility was affecting her health. It is impossible for me to tell all the wonderful stories I have heard connected with her, but I feel that I should give in detail Mr. Moffat's account of what happened the last time she saw Hilda. Her father was the well-known actor, and she is now the president of the Cape Town Psychic Club. To quote Miss Winfred Moffat's letter as follows, quote, on May the 2nd, 1936, my parents and I sailed from South Africa and we spent our last night in England at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Watson. Like my father, Mr. Watson was on the committee of the Reading Psychic College. When we arrived at the Watsons' house in the late afternoon, we found that, as a surprise for us, they had invited Hilda Lewis to supper, and she had arrived just shortly before us, and we were all sitting round the fire in the lodge, chatting before supper. Hilda was sitting in an easy chair, and there was no suggestion of anything in the nature of a seance taking place. When suddenly Hilda called out, "Oh, look!" and in her lap lay a large ripe pear. She handed it to Mrs. Watson, and immediately another pear came. This went on until there were 5 or 6 large juicy pears, one for each of us. Then a pineapple appeared in her lap, and then a second one. This all happened in a good light, and Hilda was sitting quietly in the chair with her hands on her knees. As far as I can remember, she was wearing a costume suit, and it would have been impossible for her to conceal so much fruit about her person or in the chair. She was moving quite naturally about the room before we sat down, and the chair was just like the others in the room, and there was nothing on it that could possibly conceal so much fruit. We had it for supper, and it was delicious. Mrs. Watson told us that Hilda was carrying nothing when she arrived, and the fruit was not already in the house. I remember Miss Parson, sister of the president of the Psychic College at the Reading, telling me that while Hilda was staying with her, she kept the whole household supply with fruit and sometimes vegetables in the same mysterious way. 1 minute there was no fruit, and the next minute the fruit was there, which is reminiscent of the tales of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp. I do not often tell people about these extraordinary experiences with Hilda Lewis and the pears and pineapples because it is too fantastic for most people to believe, even as they believe the miracle of the loaves and fishes in the Bible. Nevertheless, it is true and happened as I have said in the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Watson and my father and mother and myself.
Thanks, Miguel. Marion, could you continue, please?
Okay. Before closing this account of Hilda, I must give the remarkable dialogue enacted between her and my uncle, Grant Conybeare. He was the only one of my father's brothers who was not an intellectual in any sense of the word. His interests were engineering. This incident might be described as an example of Hilda's quote unquote rescue work. One day while she was in bed at the flat, to distract her attention, I gave her some paper and a pencil, asking her if she could do automatic writing. She said she would have a try. Meanwhile, I was busy in the room writing letters and not paying any attention to her. Then she suddenly asked if I knew of anybody with the name of Grant Conybeare. She had written the name down properly spelt. I replied that he was my uncle. Here I should point out that she did not know my maiden name of Conybeare, only that of Hervey, my husband's name. Close paren. Since I was also a complete stranger to her, there was no reason why she should know in any case. Apparently, she wrote down the words, quote unquote, Grant Conybeare, getting at the same time a vision of an old man bent over the steering wheel of his car. She also had a sharp pain in her heart at that moment. The vision then disappeared, and she heard a voice saying, quote, young woman, will you please help me out of my car? End quote. Hilda, with her knowledge and insight into the astral world, immediately guessed what had happened to my uncle, namely, that he was dead and not in his car at all. For she had knowledge of, quote, earthbound conditions, unquote. She then replied to him that he was not in his car and that he was dead. My uncle, who during his lifetime was a skeptic with no knowledge of or interest in spiritualism, retorted that he was not dead, and that if he were, he, quote, wouldn't know it and wouldn't see, close quote. This might well be the sort of typical remark he would have made in such circumstances. He also went on to say, quote, you just can't make a man of my age believe that sort of thing. You please just help me out of my car, close quote. But Hilda just continued to argue with him gently that he was dead and that he didn't understand where he was. But he was most obstinate, replying that he was just the same and as much alive as she was. And wouldn't she go and get someone to help a poor old man out of his car? Quote, but you are not in your car, close quote. She continued patiently. He then interrupted, quote, but I am on my way to the bench, close quote, paren. He was a J.P. and was on the way, that means justice of peace, to the Chelmsford bench when he had heart seizure and died instantaneously in the car, which happened to be going very slowly at the moment and ran up the pavement of the street. Close paren. Again, Hilda pointed out that he was really dead as the result of heart seizure. He then asked her who she was, and she explained that she was alive in this world and was a medium, and that was how it came about that she could get in touch with him and help him. He again retorted, quote, young lady, I don't believe in this sort of thing. You just help a poor old man out of his car, close quote. Meanwhile, Hilda kept on patiently repeating to him that he was dead. Whether he believed it or not did not matter, for these things just happened, and death was a natural fact just as birth was. My uncle then wanted to know what he was to do about it anyway, and whether anyone else could see him as she could. She then asked him if he knew what date of the year today was. He replied that it was February 7th, 1931. whereupon Hilda told him he was wrong, that it was now 1935 and not 1931, and that was 4 years ago, namely the date of his death that he must have given her. Then he immediately asked her if that was 4 years ago and what had been happening to him all that time, and what had he been doing? Hilda then told him that he had been what is called, quote, earthbound, and that he had not understood anything about death during his lifetime, but now that she had been able to make him realize his condition, someone would come along to help him farther. Someone would come along to help him farther. Here, Grant excitedly said that he could see his brother in the distance, but could not make him hear, quote, "Try now," commanded Hilda. Another quote, "and he will hear you," close quote. Then again, my ever obstinate little uncle retorted, "Why?" She explained again that he had been surrounded by earth barriers during his lifetime, barriers of skepticism and atheism, that the people on his side were now very much upset about him, and that the only way they had been able to reach him was to get a medium to help break down his earthbound conditions. At this point, Grant interrupted, quote, "I see my brother and Mary coming along." And there's an asterisk at Mary. Mary Max Muller was the daughter of the late Professor Max Muller, who wrote the life of Ramakrishna, and my father's first wife. So Grant interrupted, "I see my brother and Mary coming along." "Speak to them," urged Hilda. She then heard something in the distance which sounded like, quote, "At last, at last," as though my uncle had managed to get out of his car, and she felt a cold touch on her forehead, and that was the end. While this was taking place, I was writing at my bureau and was not aware of what was happening. But when I went back to her and asked her how she was getting on, she again asked me who Grant Conybeare was, and had he died on his way to the bench, giving me the date, which I wrote down, as I did not remember. Later, I looked up the exact date of his death and found that it was February 21st, 1931, not the 7th. On telling Hilda the mistake, on her part, she remarked it was curious that she was a fortnight out, and explained that the difference in the dates was a most interesting and important point, as people who have had a shock before death causing amnesia often could not remember the shock that had caused the death. So the reason why my uncle was a fortnight out on the date he had given was because he could not recollect what had happened just before he died. The following night, Hilda had a visit from my father, who thanked her for all she had done in rescuing his brother. She was frightened to begin with when she noticed his feet did not touch the floor. There's an asterisk. It says, "I understand the feet of spirits do not touch the floor." I feel I should record my last meeting with Hilda. I had paid about 2 weeks' visit to Plymouth, where she had gone to escape from phenomena hunting investigators. On my last morning there, I woke up very early, and as I lay in bed, I was somewhat gloomily meditating on the difficulties of dealing with poor little Hilda, though I was so anxious to help her. For when down in Cornwall, she did not seem at all interested that I should try to do any more for her. In fact, she did not seem the least concerned about being defended. Also, her gift for romancing was something to contend with, because she had a way of telling people a different story every time, so that one never quite knew where one was. As I was wondering whether it was worthwhile to go on bothering myself about her affairs, I suddenly became aware of something cold and hard in my right hand, which was under the bedclothes. Puzzled, I looked, and there was a lovely little red rosebud. On getting up, I found that several things in the room had been displaced, and my clock was under my bed. So, quote, Robin had been up to his pranks again. Nobody could possibly have put that rose into my hand. Also, I was awake when it happened. It was now time to leave, and I had to catch the morning train back to London. Hilda came up, and I gave her a parcel to wrap up and went on with my packing, when suddenly I heard, quote, "Hello!" I looked up and saw that Hilda was in trance and that her little Cockney control was speaking. Her face wore such an expression of cunning that I drew back with an involuntary shudder of disgust. I had quite a long conversation with, quote, him, in the course of which, quote, he told me of an address that my father had given, quote, him for me. It happened that I had lost this address and could not remember it and was worried about it. Quote, Robin also told me a great deal about the private affairs of, quote, his, or rather Hilda's enemies, which showed, quote, his malicious characteristics. At last I persuaded, quote, him to go, saying I had to finish my packing and did not want to miss the train. I was also very nervous lest the landlady might come up and see Hilda in this condition. For when she returns into, quote, Robin, she behaves exactly like a small child. Hilda, her companion and I then drove to the station. Hilda, her companion and I then drove to the station, but we were rather too early and about half an hour to wait. I was walking up and down the platform with her friend when I missed Hilda, and turning to see where she was, I saw her walking a bit behind us in the oddest fashion. She had again turned into, quote, Robin, and the few passengers about were gaping at her strange antics. Quote, Robin was a most embarrassing companion in this public space. The friend apologized and assured me that, quote, Robin was usually, quote, most careful as to Hilda's whereabouts when, quote, he made, quote, his appearances. But I did not feel that, quote, he was being careful now. I hastily shepherded Hilda into the waiting room, which was fortunately empty. Quote, Robin was in a bad mood and actually threatened me. Quote, he suspected that I now intended to try to find out something of Hilda's background by getting in touch with her family. In the end, I persuaded, quote, him to go, which, quote, he only did just as the train drew into the station. So Hilda was able to come back to herself and say goodbye. I sat down in the train with considerable relief. I felt that I had quite enough of the spirits for the time being. But I did contact Hilda's family later and found that they were just as mystified about her as I was. Eventually, Hilda gave up all psychic work and retired into private life and has married twice. On looking back now, I can well realize that the only explanation for the muddle over poor little Hilda's amazing mediumship was that the, quote, powers that be, watching behind the scenes, simply did not intend that her mediumship should continue. Do not the everlasting frustrations and perplexities of psychic research clearly indicate that we are just not meant to get too far, and that as long as we remain ordinary mortals who have not transcended Maya, the astral world must remain for us as ever an insolvable mystery? We should here note that Meher Baba has to say on the place of occultism in spiritual life, and there's an asterisk, Discourses by Meher Baba, Volume 3.
Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Many of the psychical research societies of modern times, and this is a quote, many of the psychical research societies of modern times consider occult knowledge with the same attitude which characterizes other forms of knowledge, because, in principle, there seems no reason why it should not be looked upon as being either less valuable or more valuable than other forms of theoretical knowledge. We find these societies trying to pursue occult knowledge in an organized and cooperative form. The masters also have, at times, deemed it desirable to reveal to the generality of mankind some theoretical knowledge about certain important features of the occult world, like the facts of immortality and reincarnation, the existence of different bodies and planes, and the laws concerning evolution and the operation of karma. Because such knowledge gives the right sort of background for spiritual aspiration and effort, and brings the perspective of the average man as near to the truth as is possible under the circumstances. But with the exception of general knowledge about fundamentals, the masters have consistently preferred to attach minimum importance to the spread of detailed knowledge about occult realities, and have even scrupulously withheld information in respect of those points which are likely to have vital bearing upon occultism as an art, end quote. Meanwhile, psychic research and mediumship combined were ruining my health and my character. I had become highly excitable, contentious, and with true missionary zeal. I was intolerant of those who could not share my opinions. I could not understand why people should not have the courage of their convictions. In days past, we were burnt for our opinions and principles, but now we did not have to risk anything so terrible as the stake. In psychic research, one had to be either very big, like Sir William Crookes, Sir Oliver Lodge, Richer, and other courageous pioneers, or else very small, like myself. But between these was a middle section, neither big nor small. People with professional and academic standing, why could they not be more courageous? I had become so disgusted that I lost my respect for the academic mind, for I found that learned men could become learned fools. Also, that they simply would not face up to the facts that do not fit. I felt that should I take up mediumship seriously and further develop along unusual lines, that I too would have to run the gauntlet of detractors. And I did not wish to enter the arena of psychic politics. Is it any wonder that there is a shortage of good mediums, and there is so much risk of having one's health and one's reputation ruined? Then again, my husband was getting worried, although up to now he had he says preserved. Oh, he had preserved a benevolent neutrality. Everything settled down unexpectedly by my losing my psychic faculties as quickly as they had come. As a matter of fact, my father had warned my mother that if such work proved to be too much for my health, I should not be allowed to continue it. Meanwhile, he assiduously sought to turn my attention to spiritual matters, as there is nothing spiritual about spiritualism.
Okay, let's stop here and continue next week.
Okay.